You've got a great idea for a story. Maybe it's a character, a setting, a theme, a thread of a plot. But you can't figure out how to actually start. Or maybe you have started, but a little bit down the way it all seems to fall apart. Or perhaps you're a pantser, a seat-of-the-pants writer, but you struggle because your tale always seems to lose its way. If you suffer from any of these malaises, or otherwise just want to learn how to improve the basic foundation of your story, this video is for you. This is a hands-on guide where I talk through an example showing you the process, how you can use the 3-act structure to build a foundation for the plot of your story. The goal here is to give you the tools and the confidence to do the same yourself. Hi, my name is Jonathan Oldenburg. I have been writing for 25 years now, and I have one novel out called Tears from Iron. I'm currently working on a second one with a targeted rollout date hopefully near the end of this year. I love the 3-act structure, and I use it for my novels because it just works so well for character, setting, theme, plot, all of that. For all you pantsers out there, I'm one of you too. Well, mostly. And I also prefer the term discovery writer. It seems a little more elegant. I like to let my stories breathe on their own, conjure new ideas in the process of writing and not being stuck with a strict outline. But that being said, I've also found that a little bit of structure can be critical to allow the imagination to flow free and focused. This is actually the second in a set of 2 related videos covering the 3-act structure. In the first one, titled A Deep Dive into the 3-Act Structure and Why It's So Powerful, I talked about the nature of the 3-act structure, its basic building blocks, and why it's such a powerful storytelling tool used by masters and novices alike. I have it linked in the description below, posted as one of the cards at the end of this video, and also have it tagged right up here. Check it out if you like, then come back here for some practical application. As a resource, I've also included the key points of this discussion on my website, jonathanoldenburg.com, including all the critical considerations I weighed in this example. The specific location on my website is also linked in the description below. Okay, so let's get into it. The way this video is going to work is I'm going to apply a couple of ideas to the 3-act structure to develop a basic plot. Every story and every idea is different, so there's no universal answer on how to use those to concoct a plot for your story. Indeed, a single idea could conjure a dozen possible epic adventures. With that in mind, at each step, I'll talk through what each decision resolves, where it leads next, what challenges arise, and a handful of things to consider to overcome the challenges that you may encounter. This isn't one size fits all, so I think the best way to equip you for success is to show it in action so you can then apply it to your own circumstances. I write in the fantasy genre, so that's the example I'm going to use, but frankly, this could apply to any kind of story, any kind of genre, any setting. All you need is a basic idea to get started. It may be a plot seed, a theme, a setting, a character. Having 2 or 3 of these would be even better because it can help to play them off of each other to see what combinations arise. But if you only have one, that's okay too. I will confess that as I worked through this example, it became clear that perhaps the easiest idea to work with is a plot seed, because it literally begins to steer you through a plot of a story. But as I said, any will work, and as you will see, I did not use a plot seed for this example. For this video, I didn't plan anything ahead of time. I wanted to put myself in your shoes with similar circumstances and nothing pre-scripted. So what I did was I pulled out my old book of ideas. Whenever I've had an idea for a story or a character, setting, what have you, I've jotted it down in a file and just tucked it away until maybe at some point I needed it. And what do you know? I needed it for this video. So that's what I did. I checked through that file and I picked out 2, well, call it 2.5 ideas. The 2 are both character concepts, and the half idea is a little bit of setting. My first idea is of a warrior who's just been in a battle. He entered the fight thinking he's the cat's meow, but everything went sideways. His entire side lost and was slaughtered, and he's been left for dead. He survives, though, and maybe suffers from amnesia. Well, perhaps not. That might be bordering a little too cliche for my taste. But the point is, he's thought to be slain. What does he do now? The second idea I had was a really old one that came to me about 20 years ago when I was reading Beowulf. If you're curious and want to look it up, the whole spark of an idea lasts about a page in the story and can be found between lines 2000 and 2070. But the gist of it is, 2 tribes have been at war, one is the victor, one is the loser, and as part of the brokered peace deal, the daughter of the loser's chieftain marries into the victorious tribe. Subsequently, when the defeated tribes arrive as wedding guests, they see all the treasures that were taken from them in their defeat, and their desire for vengeance grows. It seems almost certain that war will break out again, and maybe this time the defeated tribe will triumph, slaughtering their foes. As I read this scene, my mind fixed on the bride in this deal. Being sent to your blood foes, marrying into them, seems like a lonely prospect at best. And then what happens when the slaughter is unleashed against them? What I call my half idea is the setting. I write all of my books in a fantasy setting called Isfalinus, which I started back in the late 90s. Since both of the character ideas I'm working with sort of spark old Germanic culture, I think it would fit really well in one region of my world that I have not fully developed. It's called the Hinterland. The region might be more Slavic-inspired than Germanic, but close enough, I think, for our purposes. But basically, it is a wide grassland sheltered between two mountain ranges, with large forests at the foot of those mountains. The area is populated by tribal peoples who could very easily be pseudo-Germanic, pseudo-Slavic, sort of in the era of the Roman Empire. So that's it. Two ideas. One of a warrior left for dead on a battlefield, and the other of a bride in a brokered peace deal doomed to failure, and then a rough geographical setting to place them both in. The combination of such concepts could go any number of directions. We're going to find one. As we get started, I should add that one important thing to allow yourself through this process is time. Sometimes rushing or forcing through things can cause your brain to lock up and hamper your creativity. But pushing through also can be important at times if you're kind of stuck in the doldrums and sort of just need to work through it, or if you're facing a block of some sort. But sometimes you just need to allow your brain time to percolate. This whole process that we're going to be talking through took me about 10 days. I initially had a quick inspiration, which kind of began weaving things together, but along the way I hit two major roadblocks where I had to step back and over the course of a few days just let them gel in my mind until I was able to come up with some solutions. Your own timeline may vary heavily, but I want to point out that it may take more than an hour, or an evening, or a day. One of the keys of the creative process, I've preached this before and I'm sure I will again, is to know thyself. Know when you need to allow yourself time for those ideas to percolate, to allow you to come up with the best solution possible. But at the same time, know when you're playing the avoidance game and need to just buckle down and push through it to get the job done. Writing is a wonderful process, but it isn't easy. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying, or they're extremely lucky. But the effort is worth it. As you come up with your brainstorms to build this plot of yours, you will, of course, want to take some notes. You also may find it helpful to build a 3-act structure chart with lots of room for scribbles. So the first step for me was to flesh out the two character ideas I had to give them a little more depth. The warrior in particular has almost no bones on him at this point. Along with that, my initial spark of inspiration did figure out how these two characters intersected with each other, and how they were placed within the setting. But it also presented me with some serious challenges, as we shall see. Okay, so how do we fit these characters together? Let's start with the bride as we have a little more information about her. I'm going to give her a placeholder name to make this easier. We'll call her Sally for now. Since we have a pseudo-Germanic tribe, I'm going to borrow shamelessly from the Germanic tribes of the past, and we're going to call her tribe the Suebi. Sally of the Suebi. Hopefully that alliteration will help us remember. I'm going to jot it down on this chart here too. Don't worry, at some point I'm going to rename both. But at this stage of the creative process, if I turn to look for names, I often find my brain actually getting stuck on unimportant details, and so I'm going to postpone that. Sometimes a name can be a source of inspiration, but I think right now it's just going to trip me up. So Sally it is. Now we know from the idea that her tribe, the Suebi, were defeated by another tribe, and she was given in marriage to that victorious tribe as part of a peace deal. What if the warrior from my idea was a member of the victorious tribe? I'm going to give him my favorite placeholder name, Biff. And we'll borrow shamelessly again from another Germanic tribe, and we'll call his tribe the Batavi. Biff of the Batavi. Another set of alliteration there. Now, I could make Biff the groom who marries Sally. But I don't know, that really isn't sparking my imagination. It's entirely possible and probably could turn into a really good story, but it's just not speaking to me. And that's part of the storytelling process too, right? You gotta have a story that actually inspires you to write. So Biff and Sally won't marry. But maybe Biff can be the younger brother of the groom. That means he would be the son of the chieftain of the Batavi, just like Sally is the daughter of the chieftain of the Suebi. And with that, we've woven the two characters together in our setting. Awesome. But let's expand a little bit on this scenario. As I alluded to in the Sally core idea, this sounds like it would be a pretty hard circumstance for her life. Forced to marry into her tribe's blood enemies, shorn of everything and everyone she knows. That sounds miserable. To add a little extra challenge, let's make Biff's older brother a bit of a jerk, just to make life even more difficult for Sally. After all, interesting stories arise from adversity, right? And triumph. Don't forget the triumph. But there has to be adversity first. On that vein, maybe Biff and Sally don't particularly care for each other either. For now, I'm not going to worry about why they don't like each other. It may become a critical part of our plot development, or it may be something we flesh out in more detail as time goes on. But regardless, for the moment, I don't feel like I have to have the answer to that question. Perhaps these happened before page 1. I just don't know at this point. So for now, I'm just going to note these down at the very front of my 3-act chart. Now, one thing I am confident of is that the marriage between Sally and Biff's older brother should be in the story. So with that in mind, I'm going to note that down in Act 1. Okay, so let's turn to the root of the Biff idea, the battle where he's left for dead. Since the point of this inspiration to me is what happens next, this can't be the climax of the book. Theoretically, it could be the very first scene, but I don't think that's such a good idea either. Confession time. In my earliest attempt at a novel, I tried opening with a battle, thinking that the action would pull the reader in. And maybe it did a little, but the greater feedback I got was that since the audience hadn't had a chance to bond with any of the characters, they didn't really care what the outcome of the battle was, nor were they concerned about the fate of any of the combatants. I want it to be meaningful when Biff is left for dead. That means the audience needs to get to know him first. As I mull this over, the whole scene feels more akin to in Star Wars when Luke decides to go to Alderaan to become a Jedi like his father. In other words, it is the stimulus that prompts the major action. It is the end of Act 1. So let's note that down. And wow, that actually suggests something really dramatic. Remember the idea that Sally's family is incensed at all the looted treasure when they come to the wedding? With that in mind, maybe Biff isn't left for dead out on some battlefield somewhere like I'd originally imagined it. No, he's left for dead when the Swebi return and slaughter the Batavi. That would be a cool transition point, wrapping up the narrative of Act 1 and shifting into full gear in Act 2. So let's solidify this transition point. What happens to Sally during the attack? Does she spit on her new family and go back to the old with glee? Maybe that would pit Biff against Sally, and that conflict might be really interesting. But what if we force them together instead? What if Sally is deemed to be damaged goods by her father now, and is therefore intended to be slaughtered along with the rest of the Batavi? Perhaps when the attack happens, she gleefully thinks she's going home, only to bitterly realize the fate intended for her. Maybe Biff's already been cut down at this point. He's seriously wounded, believed to be dead, knocked unconscious. And maybe he comes to, in serious pain, perhaps even dying, and sees a warrior advancing on Sally. Then, with the last of his strength, he throws a knife or does something else that kills that warrior and saves her life. Then, even though she doesn't particularly like Biff, she's now indebted to him, and perhaps sees that their fates are bound together. She manages to drag him out of the ruins, tend to his wounds, and save his life. Perhaps she knows of a hidden sally port that the invaders weren't aware of, where they could escape to safety. Did you catch the pun? Sally finds the sally port? I think that's a pretty good end to Act 1, all puns aside. And no, I didn't name Sally for the Sallyport pun. I came up with her name first. But at this point in our progression, let's take a step back, take stock, and consider what we've done so far. First, you'll notice that I've already evolved my root ideas a bit from how I initially imagined them. Sally's core concept is pretty much the same, but not Biff's. I imagined some battlefield someplace where two armies in formed ranks clashed against each other among the waving grasses, or perhaps in a forest somewhere. Not a surprise assault on a village. I imagined his armed host being wiped out and not his entire people. Now that's okay with me, but depending upon what kind of ideas you're working with, such radical changes may or may not work with what you have in mind for a story. It's something to think about. How malleable can your story ideas be throughout this process? Second, while I'm really happy with what I've come up with for Act 1, I've created a bit of a problem, because I've created the opening of a tale that can go pretty much anywhere. I have failed to give myself any real direction. The linchpin of any 3-act tale is the climax, and at this point, Act 2 could go pretty much anywhere, and Act 3 be pretty much anything. When the Batavi are slaughtered, leaving Biff and Sally the only ones alive, do they separate, or do they stick together? Do they return to her family to wreak bloody vengeance? Is it a survival story of them struggling to live without food, water, resources, or family? Do they flee the hinterlands and find adventure somewhere else? In other words, my idea seeds gave me a really cool Act 1, but failed to provide me any sort of direction for the whole narrative. Remember when I said it can be easier to have a plot seed as one of your ideas? This is why. At this point in my story's development, I frankly had no real idea of where I wanted to go. But if you find yourself in a similar boat, don't despair. We shall figure this out. Indeed, figuring out this kind of tangle is one of those core concepts of basic story building. Now, before we begin work finding a solution, let me give you an example of how a plot seed idea can work so much more smoothly for developing a novel. Indeed, when I started my published novel, Tears from Iron, that's one of those core things that I had at the beginning. I wanted to tell a story about a man who is enslaved, becomes free, and then joins some rebels to fight against his enslavers. While such an idea still has many possible plot interpretations, it gives a much better roadmap as you're going through the process of building a 3-act structure. The same is true for the current novel I'm working on, called Brothers from Flame and Void. In this tale, there is a prince who leads an army across the sea to take on his people's ancient foes. Disaster strikes, he ends up marooned, and has to fight his way home. I could fill out a 3-act structure for that in seconds. Well, maybe an hour or two anyway. But if you're stuck like I currently am, let's talk about some ways to overcome this kind of a challenge. Your specific block may not be quite the same, and it may be a different genre entirely. But these are some universal thoughts about any kind of story creation, and the answers you come up with by considering these questions could help you solve this kind of a tangle. First, what is the existential threat? Now, the word existential may be overdrawn here, but I use it to keep our focus on the heart of the story. What is the big ultimate danger that overshadows your story, and if it triumphs, results in ruin for your protagonist? It could be a danger only for your hero, or for his family, or his country, or the entire world. It could be a huge threat, like a meteor about to strike the earth, an invading army crossing the frontier, a dragon running amok and burning everything. But it could be much more narrow, like a bank buying up a shop owner's property, potentially forcing the closure of a business that's been open for generations. Or maybe it's internal, like a drug addiction, which threatens to destroy family, finances, and perhaps life itself. Whatever it is, this threat is that thing that has to be grappled with by your protagonist and is the main plot, the main narrative of the story. In my example of Biff and Sally, the thing I am struggling with is that this existential threat must be something that they care about. But at the end of Act 1, as I've contrived it, Biff and Sally are bereft. They have nothing, they care about nothing, they have nothing to live for, no hope, no future. What existential threat would they give two hoots about? Why would they even care if the whole world burns? Therefore, by considering this existential threat idea, the first thing I realized that I have to do is I have to find a way to get Biff and Sally to care again. Only when they begin to care can they care to take on an existential threat. Now, to be clear, the search for meaning and hope in life could be the entire plot in a slice of Americana, or a coming-of-age story, or a work exploring philosophical despair. But the fantasy genre tends to be built upon a foundation of external threats. Thus, while this finding hope again is critical to the Biff and Sally story, and should be really, really compelling, it isn't sufficient for my purposes. They have to shift from, what do I care if the world burns, to find meaning again, so they can take on this existential threat. This idea is critically important, so I'm going to note it down on my chart. I'm not quite sure where to put it yet, but I'm going to note it down so I don't lose sight of it. Okay, for our second question, what genre are you writing in? Now, to some degree, we've already talked about this in the first question, but let's dive a little bit deeper. The genre you work with provides hints and constraints and themes that can help guide you as you develop a plot. Since I write fantasy, that might include magic, fantastical races, or other otherworldly things. If you're writing a period piece set in the 19th century, it might be the Industrial Revolution, like Charles Dickens deals with sometimes. Or it might be the changes in society's classes, like Jane Austen explores. For a contemporary spy novel, it might be things like drones or AI, weaving together with classic sneaky shenanigans and car chases. Now you might say, I want to subvert expectations by pushing the bounds of my genre. Now you can certainly do that, but be careful, because if you subvert your entire genre, then you have no genre, and you need to reconsider who your audience might be. But that's a deep topic that is tangential to what we're covering today. So let's move on. For my project, I explored the idea of cranking up the role of magic in the tale and perhaps introducing a sorcerer lord from the outside who is looking at invading the hinterlands. In his scheming, he sends agents into the region in preparation for the attack and becomes the existential threat. Now, this was an idea I juggled with for about a week because it seemed like it might be the best path to the solutions I needed. But I ended up getting stymied and hit my second major roadblock, and ultimately axed the idea. But for now, let's put it on the chart as something we're looking at as a possibility. For me, it was on the chart for about a week, like I said. The third question is one of setting and geography. Think about this in a way similar to the genre question. With the genre, we look at what an audience is expecting out of a tale, and use those concepts to help guide you along the way, or perhaps at least to provide some potential guide rails. With geography, you look at your setting for influences, groups, events, and catalysts that are present or nearby. What opportunities and challenges does your setting provide? For me, I considered the nature of the hinterland, its forests, plains, mountains, the tribes who lived in it, their villages, and so on. I was looking for environmental, political, economic, or social influences that could come into play. I also considered external threats to the hinterland by considering what was going on in adjacent areas, such as the aforementioned sorcerer lord invading idea. And ultimately, geography was going to give me the solution to my challenges, but I wasn't quite there yet as I moved through this step of the process. Now, when you think of geography, you don't only have to think of it on a grand scale. Perhaps by saying the word hinterland of a large region, I may have painted that picture. That's not the right picture. If you're telling a story set in a small farming community in the middle of Kansas, population 200, look at the geography of that town. Who are the bigwigs and the local elite? Who are the infamous ne'er-do-wells who are always getting into trouble? What are the local watering holes where everyone goes for gossip? Who is power-hungry or corrupt? Who might be a rival to your protagonist? And then also look outside of the town to the surrounding areas as well. Maybe there's some external threat from a corporate conglomerate looking to bulldoze the town for a major highway. Or perhaps a chain store is moving into the region and threatening the existence of your protagonist's little shop. That setting, that narrow world and that wide world have the possibility to provide all sorts of influences, threats, and motivations for your tale. Speaking of motivation, let's look at character motivation next. If genre considers audience expectations and geography looks at external influences, character motivation looks inward. What does your character want to do? What drives him? Also, if you have an end in mind for your story, unlike I do with Biff and Sally, it is important for you as an author to consider how you can get your protagonist to get to the mental and emotional state that you need him to achieve for the end of the story. This is an incredibly important consideration because it weaves character and plot together. At the same time, and I cannot emphasize this enough, it is a notoriously dangerous question because you can take it the wrong way. Characters are people in their own right. Yes, they only exist in the imagination in your head, but just because of that, they don't dance to the strings of whatever you want them to do. They must conform to the personality that you've established for them, and can only adapt and change due to stimulus that they experience. Forcing a character to violate his or her own personality to achieve a plot point or to serve some other purpose is a gross violation of storytelling and is the mark of a bad author. Let's take our Biff and Sally scenario for an example. At the point we've gotten to so far at the end of Act 1, Biff clearly hates the Swabby who just slaughtered his family and left him for dead. It would be very reasonable to expect Biff, therefore, to go on a one-man war against his hated foes. But what if your goal is, in the end, for Biff to become a champion of these Swabby? Is that possible? As it stands now, it would be absurd to have him suddenly say, "Oh, these guys slaughtered my family, let's be friends and I'll now be your hero." No. But you can do it if you set your breadcrumbs right. Let's say that over time Biff realizes that his own people were actually terrible and cruel. They were tyrants, pillaging, murdering, and oppressing their neighbors. For the fun of it, they kicked puppies and tortured kittens. They were just terrible, terrible people. On the other hand, he realizes that Swebby were actually one of the victims, rising up against their oppressors, and the only true chance of ending puppy kicking forever. At that point, Biff may change sides. Entirely plausible. It works. But you have to lay the trail for such a change of worldview, personality, so on and so forth. To bring this back to the broader concept of character motivation, what this means is you have two things to consider. What does the character want to do? And what do you as an author want that character to do? And how do you get them to a point where they can do that? Now, I've already got a novel where the protagonist changes sides, so I'm not going to explore that in this Biff and Sally example. Where I'm at right now, as Act 1 ends, Biff and Sally are angry, despondent, and directionless. So I'm still looking for something that wakes them up again, so they care about life, so they can take on an existential threat. In other words, at this point, while character motivation is really important and something I need to keep in my mind, it really is not helping me solve my problem with my plot. Until I can give my plot direction, this concept of character motivation remains a challenge that I cannot really fully flesh out any further. Okay, so the fifth and final question in this troubleshooting segment is, what do you have already? Or to put it in a single word, containment. This last tip is kind of an inverse of all the others. It can be very easy, especially in genres like fantasy, that tend toward big, epic struggles against great powers bent on world domination, or world annihilation, to let a story balloon out of control to massive proportions. Biff and Sally, bereft, could easily set off on a journey to take on a great tyrant, to throw a magical heirloom into a fiery mountain, or to combat a sorcerer lord, as I'd already speculated. With that in mind, it can sometimes help to think inward, to narrow that focus. This idea of containment, combined with geography, as I already talked about, is ultimately what helped guide me to the answer that I needed. But I had to work through all those other questions we talked about to get there. I scrutinized my concept of a sorcerer lord from the outside because I realized how easily that could balloon to a huge tale. I now had a much larger geography with a potentially ever-expanding cast of characters, all with their own agendas influencing the story, and potentially turning it into a monster. And frankly, I confess the sorcerer lord didn't really capture my imagination either. It was me grasping for an idea when I couldn't think of anything else. Therefore, I rejected this large external danger and refocused on the hinterland. Why not make it simple by keeping the source of evil from the first act, Sally's family, the Swebby? I'd avoided this at the beginning because I didn't really want to write a simple revenge piece. But the more I think about it as I grappled with all of these questions, the more I realized that I still could have them be the villains and not just have it be Biff and Sally take vengeance upon the Swebby. But with that, the Swebby can become my existential threat. They're close by, narrow, a focused target for my plot. And perhaps even better, keep the story personal. So how do we achieve our goal? Remember, our intention here is not to write a play-by-play of everything that happens to Biff and Sally along the way. If you have some ideas for some scenes or some other events along the storyline, by all means jot them down. But just be aware that they are largely tools for later, not now. That being said, these other ideas may help influence some of the decisions you make now, so they're not worthless for this process. But at the same time, we don't want to lose focus. What we do want to note as we continue with this process are those three critical remaining stages of the three-act structure. Specifically, the turning point in the middle of Act 2, the pit of despair that bridges Act 2 to Act 3, and most important of all, the climax of the tale. I'm going to start with the climax because that is our aim point. I cannot understate the importance of having a climax in mind very early in your story development process. Otherwise, you will lose focus. Indeed, my struggle to this point was because I did not have a climax to give me that focus, to give me that direction that I needed. I'm going to double down here and say that you have to have the climax in mind always at all stages of your writing process. If you look away from your climax, your story will take on a life of its own, veer into who knows where, and probably fall apart. There is more than one famous author who has undertaken to write a series of books, lost sight of the climax, and struggled or perhaps even failed to finish. Turning back to Biff and Sally, since I have not come up with my existential threat for the story, I can come up with a climax. But I'm going to keep it very simple at this point. But it'll be enough to give us something to steer to as we fill out all the rest. Once we get that going, we'll be able to flesh out the climax more as well. So here it is. Biff and Sally take on the Swebby. Remember, that's Sally's former tribe. and crush their imperialistic ambitions that drove them to attack Biff's Batavi in the first place. Being a writer of military fantasy, I see this playing out in some sort of battle. At this point, I don't have more than that, but it still gives us that steer point, like I said, to begin filling things in. So I'll note it down now. This tells us that through Act 2 and into Act 3, Biff and Sally must transition from devastated indifference to championing a war against the Swebi and finally defeating them in the end. So how do we get there? I think the next thing we should look at is the turning point. That leaps out to me because we still haven't figured out that critical piece of turning from not caring to caring. And I see that taking place in the middle of Act 2 in the aptly named Turning Point. Remember the conversation we had about character motivations and those changing due to influences by the author? This is where that shift should happen. Let's note it down. Now to step back a moment and look at other possible tales. Depending upon your story, this change of mind could actually happen between Act 2 and that first decision point. That might make your story a reluctant hero tale, for example. Or as another alternative, this could be the point of the story, in which case it might happen at the climax. But to focus on their change of attitude, this raises a tripartite question. First, what were they doing before the turning point? Second, what are they doing at the turning point? And third, what do they begin doing differently after the turning point? Depending upon your story, as we've talked about, this change could be something mental, like in the Biff and Sally example, or it could be something physical. First, let's look at the before. So we have Sally on their own in the hinterland in a world of various tribal peoples, fighting with each other sometimes, maybe sometimes at peace with each other, negotiating, trading, what have you. But in some, it can be a very violent and warlike society. Now, I would imagine amid such a culture, there would arise various, shall we say, free companies, or less kindly, brigands, clanless, lordless, outcast warriors, wandering without a home and taking what they can by force. Since Biff and Sally are drifting around without any ties, I can see them linking up with one of these groups as a very natural occurrence because these brigands would have a similar circumstance and mindset. We've already established that Biff is the son of a tribal chieftain, but we can also reinforce in Act 1 that he's a capable warrior, which means he would be more likely to be accepted by such a group and flourish once he does join a brigand company. But let me add that notation onto the chart just so I don't forget. Meanwhile, I'm imagining Sally as being well-spoken, intelligent, and clever. She's already been established as something of a survivor, having been married off into a tribe that wasn't her own. Thus, she would probably be able to carve her own place amid such a band, using words as her weapon rather than a sword. Yet putting them with a group of clanless brigands doesn't necessarily solve our problem, because we want them to shift out of that mindset. We still have our dilemma, but at least we have some direction to guide us now. I can see that gradually living among such a group of people, there might be a bit of a realization that one doesn't like what one sees, a comparison of self versus others, and finding them wanting and then maybe finding self wanting, which could lead to that shift to care again because they see that not caring is just really a bad way to go. But ultimately, there must be a trigger point from first I go this way to now I go that way. And we must remain fixed on our climax. That trigger point must lead Biff and Sally to taking on the Swebi, like we want them to in our climax. Remember, always keep your eye on the climax. To solve our turning point dilemma, I think it might be helpful to add a third tribe alongside the Batavi and the Swebi. We could call them Tribe C, but in keeping with our ripping off of Germanic tribal names, let's call them the Cheruski. C for Cheruski. With that, we can establish that at the beginning of the story, there were three major tribes in the region, the Batavi, the Cheruski, and the Swebi. And there's probably a myriad of smaller tribes who may align with one or the other, or just try to stay out of these fights. But there's the three tribes vying for overall dominance in the region. So building on this turning point idea, let's say that Biff and Sally's brigands run afoul of these Cheruski. Many of them are slaughtered, and the remainder, including Biff and Sally, are taken captive and brought before the Cheruski chieftain. For simplicity, we'll give him a placeholder name of Chuck. Chuck of the Cheruski. Now, it probably would make sense for a chieftain like Chuck to judge these brigands to be evil men worthy only of death. Now, he'd probably admire their fighting prowess, but ultimately would observe that clanless men can't be trusted, and as such they have no value. This could prompt Biff and Sally to reveal their true pedigree. Wait, we're not clanless, we're from the Batavi! That might intrigue Chief Chuck. After all, the Batavi are the blood enemies of the Swebi. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, as they say. And he needs more warriors in the impending battle that he sees against the Swebi. Yet still, given their choices and the fact that they are not Cheruski, but rather Batavi, he may find their loyalties still to be a little bit suspect. What does one do in such a circumstance? Well, the classic answer from history is to take a hostage. So he would take Sally hostage to ensure Biff's loyalty as a war leader. Biff would likely retort that Sally means nothing to him. After all, we established early on that Biff and Sally don't particularly like each other. They were forced together by shared circumstance, from saving each other's lives, and the bond that comes from that. But they still may not entirely get along. But Chuck will disagree, perhaps seeing something that Biff does not yet see in himself, that he actually does care about Sally. This is something we can flesh out as we go along, writing the story. The point here, though, is that Biff enters Chuck's service, swears an oath, and Sally remains a hostage to ensure his good behavior. But this doesn't remove Sally from the picture either. She would be in the court of the chieftain, and she's clever, as we established, and so she can use her wit and wisdom to influence events. Thus, we get to the third question of what happens after the turning point. Before they were with the brigands, at the turning point, they face this challenge with Chuck and enter his service. After the turning point, and for the remainder of Act 2, it would make sense, therefore, that Biff is fighting wars on behalf of the Cheruski and his new chieftain, Chuck. Perhaps to take some biblical inspiration, maybe he'll make a name for himself as a war leader, much like David did in the service of King Saul. To borrow a quote, Chuck has killed his thousands, Biff his 10,000s. This rising prestige may cause some enmity and mistrust between Chuck and Biff, but it also increases Biff's value because he is proving to be such a good commander. Besides, both of them still have the same shared objective, the defeat of the Suebi. Chuck wants this for his imperialistic ambitions, and Biff for revenge. Yes, I said I don't want revenge to be the core of my story, but that doesn't mean it has to be entirely absent. It makes sense that Biff would want some revenge. But the three-act structure always has a point where things go terribly wrong. The pit of despair. I think a good pit here would be when Biff and Sally come to the conclusion that Chuck and the Cheruski are no better than the Suebi. Everyone is equally bad, and there are no heroes. Is there anything worth fighting for if no one's better off in the end? The climb out of this pit that ultimately leads to the climax would be Biff coming to the grudging conclusion that he has to step up and defeat both the Cheruski and the Suebi. Now, as soon as I thought of this idea, the Battle of Sekigahara popped into my head. This was fought by Tokugawa Ieyasu in Japan during the Sengoku Jidai period, also known as the Warring States. It is not a perfect fit for anyone who has read the battle, but my memory wasn't perfect, and I came up with the idea, then I looked up the battle and realized I was a little bit off. But that's okay, I'm not trying to retell the Battle of Sekigahara, I'm merely using it as a point of inspiration. For our purposes, I think it would be cool if Chuck sets up for a battle between him and the Suebi, and then he sends Biff off on an envelopment of the Suebi lines. When Biff arrives in that position, he stays there, letting the two sides fight each other to exhaustion. One of them will break. At this point, I don't know that I really care which one. We'll figure that out as we go along. But one of them will break and will be pursued by the other. And at that point, Biff will then enter the battle and defeat the exhausted victors. He will be the one who's triumphant. For this to work, of course, Sally needs to escape from her hostage situation, without Chuck learning of the betrayal until it's too late. That's a subplot that I don't really feel like I have to flesh out now, but I will definitely note it down to take care of later. And with that, we have it. We have a basic story in a three-act structure. Sally marries into Biff's tribe. The tribe is attacked by Sally's old family. They're both intended to be killed, but manage to escape, join up with a band of brigands, who are then captured by Chuck and the Cheruski. They enter Chuck's service, realize that Chuck is no better than the Suebi, and then in the ultimate climax, Biff manages to turn the battle in his favor so that both the Cheruski and the Suebi are defeated, and Biff rises triumphant and can usher in a new age of glory, splendor, and wonder for all. Or some such. I'm going to talk about the resolution here in a moment. Indeed, as we conclude, I have 5 closing thoughts for you. First, my development went essentially in this order: figuring out the core of Act 1, the transition from Act 1 to Act 2, jumping ahead to the climax, then turning back to relook at the turning point, the pit of despair, and then adding some meat to that climax in the end. Depending upon what your ideas are and where they take you, you may find it helpful to work through those different stages in a different order than I did. The main thing to remember is that the climax is the most important one. Get that figured out, at least as a basic concept, as soon as you can. It will make it a lot easier for you. Once you've got it, it is your guiding point, your North Star, to figure out the rest of your story. Second, as I said, I'm not really that worried about the resolution at this point. It could be one of many things, and personally, I like to let my resolutions emerge naturally from the story writing process. Do Biff and Sally ride off into the sunset? Is one or the other or both tragically lost? If both survive, what do they do? The story will tell me, and I don't need to know right now. As an example, when I was writing Tears from Iron, I had no idea until into the third act whether the protagonist would survive the story or not. Indeed, I intentionally didn't try to figure it out early. That uncertainty passed on from me to the reader, turning into a higher level of suspense for them, gripping them to keep reading the tale. I won't tell you which way it fell out. You'll have to read the book to find out. Third, you'll notice that most of the critical points I've come up with are what might be called external plot points. They are physical actions, sometimes across geographical space, resulting in physical outcomes. From the setup and throughout, I've hinted at certain internal aspects that still need to be fleshed out. Perhaps before the writing begins, but maybe as I work through the process. The most important of these is the relationship between Biff and Sally. They start out as grudging, forced together allies, but what do they become? Concerning the decision points, they may go through their own crises and evolve to their own new conclusions at a different pace from each other. They don't have to experience first I go this way and now I go that way at the same moment for each of those decision points. Now at the turning point itself, I think it makes sense that they do because they're under the threat of death from Chuck and the Cheruski, and so that works out really well. But through the other ones, as they gradually become perhaps disenchanted with the Brigands, and later on as they become disenchanted with the Cheruski, they could go through those stages at different times and perhaps even for different reasons. But to my mind, they both reach the same or at least compatible mindsets in the end. Because I'm a big softie at heart, I think they'll actually grow to like each other. But that doesn't have to be resolved right now because I don't have to know that aspect of their lives and their personalities in order to create that core 3-act structure plot. If you are developing a story where the key transition point from Act 1 to Act 2, the turning point, the pit of despair, or the climax, are more founded upon those internal states, you may need to know them now as they are the keys that you are fixing on. Fourth, if you do become stuck, as I did for a while, it may be helpful to talk these things out. Do you have a friend who is sufficiently interested in the craft that they would be willing to discuss it with you? Buy them a coffee and have a good conversation. They should be someone who is willing to challenge you, to challenge your perspectives, to question what you've come up with. Gently, hopefully. Sometimes merely the act of trying to put a challenge into words, rather than just a jumble of thoughts in your head, is all you really need. So if you don't have a friend, or if you don't want to bother them, or you haven't got to that stage yet, perhaps just try writing it down. Perhaps draft an email you don't intend on sending, and put all your struggles into writing, and you may lead yourself to a conclusion. Or go on a walk, talk it out, and let the neighbors wonder if you've gone daft in the head. That might work too. Finally, none of what I've done so far with the Biff and Sally story is set in stone. Not even the climax. We are fixed upon it, and always should be like I said, but that doesn't mean it can't evolve too as we continue through this process. There's an old military axiom that no plan survives contact with the enemy. I think the same thing could be said here. No story outline survives contact with the page. As you go through the process of prepping for the novel and then actually writing it, you'll discover things, unearth unanticipated problems, and unveil cool new ideas, all of which may require adjustments to give you the best possible story in the end. And with that, we are there. Remember, if you want to learn more about the foundational principles of the 3-act structure, I've also released a companion video today titled A Deep Dive into the 3-act Structure and Why It Is So Powerful. That is linked below. It's on one of the end cards you'll see in a moment, and it's right here. Also, don't forget that I've got talking points for this video on my website, jonathanoldenburg.com, and I've got that linked below as well. This kind of a format was a new experiment for me, so I would love to get your feedback on how it went. Specifically, was it useful for you, or am I missing something? I want to ensure that the time you spend watching these videos is fruitful. Do I have any blind spots? One of the things I've learned in life is that when instructing on a concept, sometimes there are things that I take as so instinctive that I don't even think to explain them. And so it's entirely possible that I have completely missed core things I should have talked about in this video. If I fell into that trap, please let me know in the comments, and I'll either respond in the comments or perhaps roll out a whole nother video depending upon what it is in order to make sure I cover it. If you find this content helpful, please like and subscribe to see more. I'm currently working on 2 different video series, this one on writing and then a second one on world building for all those fantasy and sci-fi lovers out there. I release about 1 video a month on one or the other topic, and the intention with both is that we work side by side, just like we did in this video, going through the process of developing the story or the world so you can see how it can be done, so you can see that you can do it yourself, so that you feel empowered, motivated, and inspired to truly harness your imagination. If you have any thoughts on anything I've covered, or if there's anything else that you would like me to talk about, please add them in the comments below as well. I would love to hear if this practical example was helpful for you. And with that, I'll say goodbye and have a good day.